If sourdough feels complicated, I get it. But here's the thing. I make sourdough for my family almost every day, and most of the time I only rotate through a handful of recipes. In this video, I'm sharing 5 of the things I make on repeat using the exact same dough for some of them. I'm also going to talk about simplifying sourdough because I think a lot of people give up before they even give it a fair try, mostly because internet convinces them they need to be doing fancy shaping techniques, measure everything to a gram, and so on and so forth. And if you're a busy mom just trying to feed your family, you don't need to do all the extra stuff. I'll talk a lot about what I call the last 10%, and those are little steps that might make things a bit prettier or more artisan, but aren't actually necessary for great sourdough. So, whether you're brand new or just need a bit of encouragement or even just some inspiration about what to bake next, this video is for you. I'll mainly be addressing some things I stopped doing on a daily basis with a few years of experience under my belt, and also how to simplify your baking in general. The recipe I make most often, by far, is my basic artisan boule. I bake it at least 2 or 3 times a week, and there's a reason for that. It's simple, it's flexible, and it almost always turns out well. I skip a lot of the extra steps people say are musts, and honestly, I don't think they make much of a difference in the final loaf. For example, I mix everything, so flour, water, salt, and starter, all at once. Technically, you're supposed to do an autolyse first, which means mixing just the flour and water and letting it sit before adding anything else. But I've tested it both ways, so with autolyse and without it, and I didn't notice enough of a difference to justify the extra step. That said, I do always give the mixed dough a rest for at least 30 minutes before I do anything else, because with a high hydration dough for artisan bread, the flour does need that time to absorb the water. If you skip that rest and try to do anything at all with the dough, it just usually won't work. I do think stretch and folds are also important, but not in a super rigid way. As long as you get them done during the first 2 hours of bulk fermentation, you're fine. Sometimes I do one stretch and fold, sometimes I do three. It depends on my day a lot. So if I'm home, if I have errands to run, or if I just forget, honestly, and that happens a lot. As you saw, I don't overcomplicate the shaping either. I skip pre-shaping entirely because it's not worth it for me, and I just roughly shape the dough. I think of it more like getting it into the right shape again after taking it out of the bowl, and that's pretty much it. Now, one thing I do think makes a big difference is how you bake your bread, and specifically using something that traps steam while you bake it. My go to is, of course, a Dutch oven. It creates the perfect environment for oven spring. That's where the loaf gets that beautiful rise in the first 15 minutes or so of baking. But if you don't have a Dutch oven, the next best option is what's called the two-pan method. It's super simple. You shape your dough like a sandwich loaf and place it into a regular loaf pan. Then you take another loaf pan, flip it upside down, and place it on top to create a little steam chamber. And that mimics the effects of a Dutch oven surprisingly well. I've got a whole separate video that walks you through that two-pan method step by step, and I'll link it down below if you want to check it out. I'll also link the recipe I'm showing you here along with the two-pan method version because the dough is nearly identical, but the shaping and the baking process is just a bit different. Next, I'm mixing up a double batch of my brioche dough. This is probably the most versatile dough I make. I use it for almost every sweet bake, so from cinnamon rolls to babkas, Hawaiian rolls, you name it. Most of the time, if I come across a recipe I like, I'll just use my brioche dough instead of the one they give me. So I'll follow the instructions of a recipe developer for the filling and the shaping, but I stick to my dough because I know it by heart. I know how it behaves, I know how long I need to bulk ferment it, and so on. And that right there is one of the biggest ways I simplify sourdough baking. Because once you master a type of dough, brioche in this example, you don't have to constantly look up measurements or stress about whether it's going to work. It just saves you so much mental energy, especially if you bake a lot or you're just trying to get things done with kids around. Plus, once you've got your go-to dough, you can always make a double batch or even triple batch, and you can bake in bulk that way. That's what I'm doing here actually. I'm using this double batch of brioche dough to make two different desserts. The first is sourdough buchtelen, which are those sweet Austrian rolls traditionally filled with apricot jam. We're using strawberry jam instead of apricot because that's what we like better. And with the second half of the dough, I'm making sourdough mascarpone collages with strawberry jam. And just to be clear, I'm not making both of those bakes on the same day because we can't eat that much. I made the buchtelen first, and then a couple of days later, I used the second half of the dough for the mascarpone collages. There's another reason I love brioche dough. It ferments really slowly, much slower than a basic bread dough made with just flour, water, salt, and starter. I'm pretty sure it's the fat that slows the fermentation down, but either way, it makes the dough super forgiving. I've bulk fermented this dough for 8 hours and also for 12. I think I went up to 14 or 16 in the winter once, and in all cases, it worked out just fine. I think I've over fermented every other dough at some point, but not my brioche. So if you're not planning to use all the dough at once, it's totally fine. Just use half of it right after bulk fermentation and pop the rest in the fridge. You can use it in a day or 2 days later, or you can go even longer. I just wouldn't go past 3 days because the sourness does get a bit stronger and I find it a bit too pronounced for sweet bakes at that point. The process is really straightforward. I mix all the ingredients at once and then I add the butter a few minutes in. Ideally, the butter is at room temperature, but when I forget to take it out of the fridge, I just melt it sometimes and it still works. It's not the best, but it's good enough for me. I mix everything in the stand mixer for about 10 to 15 minutes, then aim for 2 or 3 stretch and folds in the first couple of hours. But honestly, I've skipped them and the dough still turned out fine. It's slightly less fluffy that way, but still very good. I'd say plan to do the stretch and folds, but if life happens and when life happens, you'll still get a decent bake without them. One more tip that comes to mind here, think about how you will use the dough. So if you're shaping it into rolls or small balls like for this buchtelen recipe, it's easier if the dough is chilled a bit. But if you're rolling it out for cinnamon rolls or babka, it helps if the dough isn't too cold. So I'll let it sit at room temperature for an hour or two before rolling it out in those cases. And if I need to start the shaping with getting the dough into multiple smaller balls of dough like I'm doing here, I'll pop it into the fridge for about 2 hours before I attempt to shape them. And as you can see, these are all great recipes to do with your kids. The dough is pretty firm, so even if they squish it in all kinds of impossible ways because, they don't exactly know what they're doing yet, it's usually fine. The stage my kids are in, and I'm happy to let them help because it doesn't ruin the dough. Now, even though I try not to overcomplicate sourdough, when it comes to things like buchteln or really anything where you want evenly sized pieces, I actually do recommend weighing the dough. It just makes life easier. Now, for something like bagels, where the dough is really firm and is keeping the shape really well, I usually just divide it by eye, so cut it in half, then in half again, and so on, and I manage to get even bagels that way. But with brioche dough, especially when it comes out of the fridge and it's just an uneven blob of dough at that point, it's hard to eyeball it, so I throw each piece on the scale. That way I get really nice, even cinnamon rolls or buchtelen or dinner rolls, whatever I'm making. So on that note, I highly recommend getting a kitchen scale. You don't need anything fancy, just one that shows grams. I honestly can't even link you to mine because I'm pretty sure they don't make it anymore. I've had it since before I even had my own kitchen. Back when my husband and I first moved in together, I took it from my mom because she didn't use it as much, and it still works. I just change the batteries every once in a while, and it's probably one of the most cost-effective and useful tools you can get for sourdough baking. And it's not just helpful for portioning the dough. It's especially important when you're mixing ingredients or if you're experimenting with different flours, especially if you're milling your own. I've been following a lot of sourdough bakers using freshly milled flour, and I know it's only a matter of time before I go down that path too. Anyways, when you're using whole grains, the majority of people say a scale really becomes essential. So, for example, 100 grams of wheat berries gives you 100 grams of flour. But a cup of wheat berries gives you more than a cup of flour once you grind it because it takes up more space. So volume just doesn't translate well in baking, especially not when you're working with different types of flour. As a European, I never fully understood volume measurements, but I do try to empathize with everyone in the US who's grown up using them, and I do use them sometimes myself as well, and they have their place. But for me, I'm using my scale way more, especially for sourdough. So if you're thinking about the next thing to invest in for your kitchen, not just for sourdough, but for baking in general, and you don't have a scale yet, just get one. Kolaches are a type of sweet pastry made with a soft, puffy dough and a fruit or creamy filling in the center. The filling really depends on the region. Some places use cottage cheese, others use different types of jam. They originate from Central Europe, but you can find them in bakeries all over the region. We have our own versions here in Slovenia too, and that was what actually inspired me to recreate them using sourdough, because they are one of my favorite things to get in bakeries. Oh, and by the way, you can find all the recipe links down in the description box and on my blog, stretchandfolds.com. And if the recipe isn't on my blog yet, I'll include the ingredients and instructions written out for you below. So back to the collages. To make them, you start the same way as with buchtelen. Divide the dough into equal pieces and then shape them into small balls. Then you let them rise for their second proof as dough balls, and this can take anywhere from 1 to 2 hours, depending on how warm your kitchen is. But they should almost double in size and look visibly puffy before you move on. Once they've risen, take a small glass or something similar and gently press down into the center to create a dent for the filling. And a little tip here, if you chill your glass in the fridge first, that makes it much easier to press down without the dough sticking to the glass. Then spoon your filling of choice into each dent. Around here, mascarpone is pretty common. My country is right next to Italy, so that might be why. And I used mascarpone and the same strawberry jam I used for the buchtelen, and it was a great combo for the filling. After that, you just bake the collages and dust them with a bit of powdered sugar once they've cooled. And another important tip, don't overfill them. I'm always tempted to add just a little too much because I want lots of filling. But once the mascarpone and jam start to melt in the oven, it can overflow and spill out. So what I do is I aim to add just slightly less than what feels right, and then they usually turn out just perfect. This next recipe is what I started to call my fast food dough, because we mostly use it for hot dog buns and burger buns. It's actually based on my go-to sandwich bread dough, which I'll show you next, but I made a few tweaks. I added more butter for that rich, soft texture, and a little more flour to make the dough easier to shape. I kept the Tangzhong in because it helps the buns stay soft and fresh for days. And in this video, I'm using the dough for hot dog buns, but you can use it for practically anything that needs to be soft, buttery, and pillowy. Now let's talk about Tangzhong a little bit. Tangzhong is something I only started using recently, maybe about half a year ago. And it's originally a Japanese method, I believe, and it's used to make their milk bread super soft. The word tangzhong basically refers to a paste you make by heating up milk and flour together until it thickens, and then you add that paste to your dough. Now, the reason it works is actually pretty interesting. When you heat flour with liquid, the starches in the flour swell up and trap more water than they would if you were just mixing everything cold. So when you add that tangzhong to your dough, it essentially helps the dough absorb more moisture and hold on to it better during baking. and the result is a softer texture that doesn't dry out as quickly, so you can count on the bread staying fresh for longer as well. The way I use it in sourdough baking is basically how I would treat adding butter to a dough. I make the Tangzhong paste first, so it has time to cool before I use it. You don't want to add it hot because that could kill the yeast in your starter. So I make the paste, set it aside, maybe make myself a cup of coffee while it cools. Then I mix all the other ingredients in the stand mixer just until they're nicely incorporated, so just a few minutes. And then I add the Tangzhong paste in. Then I mix for about 10 more minutes, and you should end up with a nice dough ball that you can then transfer out of the bowl of the stand mixer into another bowl to bulk ferment. And this dough is also a great example of where I apply the last 10% principle I talked about in the beginning of this video. So when shaping the dough, a lot of recipes tell you to divide the dough, shape it into balls, and then let them rest for 10 to 15 minutes before shaping again. And I skip that rest if I don't have time for it. I do make sure to include that rest for tortillas, for example, because you can't roll them thin without them resting for a little bit. But for buns, I just keep going. So the first few are a bit tighter to shape, but by the time I get to the last one, they are usually relaxed enough for the shaping to be a little bit easier. So my tip about the rest period is this. Try it. If the dough is easy to shape straight after dividing, then keep going. If it's fighting back, pause and give it a rest and then continue. And same goes for brushing with butter. Most recipes tell you to brush your buns and rolls butter or milk before and after baking, and I usually just brush them after. Doing both doesn't make a huge difference for me, and just brushing after is way quicker, obviously. And finally, there's the step of adding steam to your oven. So with buns, we're obviously not using a Dutch oven, and unless you have a steam oven, some recipes will tell you to use lava rocks or wet towels to create steam. That will give you a 5 to 10% boost in oven spring in my experience, and because of that, I usually just skip it. It's simply not worth it for me. And I saved my favorite for last, and that's sourdough sandwich bread with Tangzhong. This recipe, like the last one, has the same extra step right at the beginning, and that's making the Tangzhong paste. If you've made sourdough sandwich bread before, you know how quickly it can go stale. This version with Tangzhong keeps soft and fresh for 2 or 3 days, I would say. And that's perfect if you don't have a big family eating the whole loaf in one sitting. The process is fairly easy. I make the Tangzhong first, it takes about 5 minutes, and let it cool slightly while I mix the rest of the ingredients. I add the Tangzhong in once the dough is already mixing, just like I do with butter in brioche. And at this point, I like to do a mini rest. I found that if I go straight into mixing again, the dough can still feel sticky and underdeveloped. I think it's because the flour hasn't had enough time to fully absorb the water yet. So I let it rest for about 15 or 20 minutes before continuing, just like I would with a high hydration artisan dough. And you might wonder why I didn't do that with the fast food dough. And it's simply because the sandwich bread dough has more water in it, and that makes it sticky if we don't let the flour absorb that water. And once it does, it becomes very manageable. I won't go into full details here because I have a separate video on how to make this exact bread step by step, and also a blog post with a printable version of the recipe on stretchandfolds.com. And as usual, I'll link both below if you want to check that out. I'm not saying the extra steps don't make a difference. They do. And most recipe developers include them because they want you to get the best possible result. Even on my blog, I include all the steps, but I try to be really clear about which ones are necessary and which ones are just maybe a bit optional. Because if all those little steps are what's keeping you from baking bread, I want you to know it doesn't have to be perfect. If skipping a few things means that you get to make bread for your family instead of buying it at the store, then I'll help you pick what to skip. Most of sourdough recipes out there are written to help you make perfect bread. But for most of us, especially in the middle of a busy life, what we really need is very decent bread. Bread that's good, consistent, and most importantly, not overwhelming to make. If you're new here, I would love for you to subscribe. I put out a new video every Friday and I focus mainly on sourdough, from scratch cooking and natural living. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and please don't hesitate to comment if you have any questions or just to let me know if the video was helpful to you or not. I hope to see you again here next week. Bye!